Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Steve Rios. Welcome to Season 2 of Wavemakers. This season on Wavemakers, we're going to be focused on writers, authors, books. And our first guest is Mr. Brian McFarland. Mr. McFarland is a 91-year-old Canadian who is known as Canada's premier historian of hockey. He is also a writer of more than 100 books, including a series called The Mitchell Boys, which kind of makes sense because Brian McFarlane's father, Leslie McFarlane, wrote The Hardy Boys, the first 20 years worth of Hardy Boys books from 1927 to the 1940s. Brian McFarlane's father wrote The Hardy Boys. And so we're going to be talking to him a little bit about Hardy Boys, a little bit about Mitchell Boys, a little bit about hockey, and a lot about him. So I hope that you can join us and that you will enjoy this very interesting man and the Season 2 launch of Wavemakers.
How is it that you describe yourself? You mentioned 91 years. So when you look at 91 years and who you are now, what you've been, how do you describe yourself, Mr. Brian
Well,
McFarlane?
I'm an old man. I'm an old man, Steve, but I don't feel like an old man, especially up here. The body is starting to wane and wear. I'm diabetic. I have, for your information, an incurable heart issue that I'm facing, but it is treatable. And I take 4 big pills every morning, and that's going to extend my life somewhat. And really, I'm surprised that I'm not more concerned about this condition, but I look back and say diabetes might have taken me several years ago, and it hasn't. Maybe this situation will have the same outcome, but I don't even lose any sleep over it. So I try to be as creative every day as I can and paint a picture, or write some words in my computer, and I'm satisfied with that. I have a wonderful wife who looks after me and caters to my every need, and 2 daughters that phone me every day to say, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. Why are you planning a trip? And I have to go to Ottawa next month. I have to go to London this weekend.
Oh my!
So we're busy. And
Oh my!
Again, I'm getting wordy, so I'll just end that paragraph right here.
And I'm going to have to control myself because you say things that I just want to go on a tangent about, but I'm not going to ask you about London right now.
Okay.
I will say though, how much of an influence was your father? The wonderful Canadian writer Les McFarlane on your life as a writer. I know we could ask so many different things, but just focusing on your life as a writer, and say what.
Okay, I have to think about that. Obviously, he had to have some influence. In fact, probably quite a lot of influence, whether I realized it or not. But that's growing up with 3 kids in the family, and he was struggling to make a living. There weren't very many freelance writers around in North America back in the 20s and the 30s when he started out. And he was prolific. He churned out short stories and articles, and he was always writing a diary every day. And it was grim. It was depression. And he was wondering where the next 15 or 20 bucks he was going to make for writing an article would appear in the mail in the form of a check. As for writing, we just took it for granted that that's what he did for a living. And we had wonderful childhoods. My sister and I agree that back in the 30s, early 30s, when we were born and growing up, we had a lot of fun. We had friends to play with, and there were no rules or restrictions, no people saying, be careful of people that looks mysterious or threatening. we just played hockey and baseball and all those other kids' games and had a wonderful growing up here. We didn't know we were poor because everybody else was poor too. And I don't think I even considered his influence on me as a writer till I got out of college, perhaps, and decided I might try to write a few things. I did want to write one book to prove to my dad that my sister wasn't the only writer in the family. He kind of doted on her, saying she's going to be the great Canadian novelist someday.
Oh,
And she
my.
did turn out to be a very skilled writer and has written several novels, some of them very well accepted in the US. She lives there. So I was kind of secondary in the family when it came to writing, but I did plan to write one book. And that turned into 2 and 3 and 5 and 10 and 20 and now probably around 100. So I look back and say, I don't even know how that happened in all those years.
Wow.
There you go.
Well, that's definitely one of the questions as a new writer myself. That was definitely one of the questions that we were going to get to. And it's actually in the second half, but it should be up here, which is how on earth does a person write so much? And you said it's not like you started when, you were a teenager. You were already in college or a college graduate. How does a person get to the point of having so many books written? Where did you find the time? Because it wasn't your full-time work. You're a very accomplished broadcaster.
Well, I was pretty busy, but they didn't pay much money for broadcasting back then. So I felt if I could make a quarter of my income each year from broadcasting and a quarter of it from writing and a quarter of it from making speeches to Rotary clubs and whatever you have and make $100 or something for showing up and making a speech. And there's another quarter in there for something else, but promotions or entrepreneurship, then I could make a fairly good living. And that's how I put my kids through college and was able to buy a house eventually. And, it all worked out pretty well. So that was my approach. And I see guys now in broadcasting making $1 million a year, no problem with doing play-by-play for the major league ball clubs or whatever. It's probably more than $1 million a year. I'm not envious. It's just times have changed and they get a lot more money than I did. And we didn't have agents. In fact, we weren't allowed to have agents back then. They threatened you with dismissal if you came in with a representative to sign a contract with them. And the players were in the same boat back then. The hockey players were anyway. And I think many sports, it was the same. So there you go.
Yeah, so no, that makes sense then. Basically, and what's interesting about that, Brian, is that, having read one of your father's autobiographies, that's a lot of the reason why he did what he did in terms of the Hardy Boys and the David Fearless and other books, is that he kind of had to. He had a family.
That's right. Yeah, and the Hardy Boys were almost an accident. He was a newspaper man in Springfield, Massachusetts. I think he was on his way to New York to try to become a Broadway playwright, but he got stuck in Springfield writing for a very conservative newspaper. And there was an ad in the paper, writer wanted for juvenile series. And he answered the ad and he got the job from a fellow named Stratmeyer in New Jersey, who was kind of the king of the juvenile fiction books at that time. The Hardy Boys hadn't been invented, but the Motor City Boys had, and the Such and Such Boys, and the Carolyn Keene series. And this man in New Jersey had all these writers writing for them under assumed names, because if he ever had a problem with them, he could just replace them with somebody else who would work for $100 a book. And that was sort of the standard fee, $100 a book, no royalties. No writers associations to defend the writers or ask for royalties or demand royalties, and no agents really around. So my dad was happy to get $100 a book to write a book. He could polish one off in a week or two and get these kids into trouble. He didn't like the plot lines, which were supplied by the publisher. So he would embellish them a bit or reach out beyond the barriers and bring in an Aunt Gertrude, for example, for the Hardy Boys series. And he was inventive, and he thought when it got to be the Hardy Boys, he would put a little more attention to his writing, a few more difficult words that a kid might say, "Hey, Dad, what does this word mean?"
Like audacity.
And yeah, and he was never proud of the work. He knew it was pretty much hack writing. And he would polish these books off in no time and get us $100 because he had to put fuel in the furnace for the winter, and he had to feed 3 growing kids. And he dismissed them. He never read a book over again. And he used to admonish me, "Don't tell your friends I'm writing this nonsense," meaning the Hardy Boys. And I said, "Dad, we're all reading that stuff. We're trading books. Everybody's reading them." And he was astonished. He said, I know. He went to a department store to make sure I was right, that they had Hardy Boys books on the shelves. And they had lots of Hardy Boys books on the shelf.
It's wonderful. And how did you feel like when you realized my father basically breathed life into this series, into these boys?
Yes, he did. And I was just 10-year-old or 12-year-old, so just stupid enough, didn't care much about how he reacted or how. I just knew I enjoyed, if I got sick with flu and had to stay home, I'd read an entire Hardy Boys books to pass the time. And I realized they were exciting. And all my friends felt the same way. And the girls felt the Carolyn Keene series, written by a lady named Mildred Wirt in Toledo, Ohio. The girls were reading Carolyn Keene. We were reading Franklin W. Dixon.
Well, your father was
told me
he was Carol for a little bit, wasn't he?
Yes, he was for 9 books, I think, or maybe half a dozen. But he said he didn't enjoy writing the Hardy Boys, actually, but he didn't enjoy writing the Carolyn Keene books, well, even less. So
I can imagine.
I can imagine.
Well, I'll tell you, I definitely have been enjoying your father's writing, and I have enjoyed even more doing research, not even more, but I've also enjoyed doing research and listening and reading about other men, mostly men, who have written about Hardy Boys and your father, and really talking about what is the great value of this series. And honestly, Brian, I myself said, as a reporter, a former reporter, I said to myself, and as a researcher, I got to get down to a little bit more about the popularity of these books. And when I started researching it, really the character richness, okay? But even more so, Brian, these men are talking about the relationship that Mr. Hardy had with his boys, that he would talk to them, that he would mentor them, that he would, the kind of things that you put in the Mitchell boys, that really struck a chord with me, because so often fathers are not well portrayed. So what do you think about that aspect of it? Was that from your grandfather? Was it from your father? That strong boy-father relationship?
Well, I don't want to disappoint you, but it wasn't really a strong bond, grandfather to grandson or son. My dad was just my dad, a quiet little guy, about 5'3", very modest, very shy. Like, he couldn't make money from speech making like I have. I've done a banquet in New York for 33 years consecutively at the Waldorf Astoria. Of course, that was a gratis one because we were allowed to bring our wives down for the weekend and nobody got paid at the head table. But that could be a good income, could have been a good income for my dad if he'd been a better speech maker, perhaps, than he was. But he was too shy at the limelight to really perform well in that setting. So I'm getting lost in my thoughts here. The bond. My dad was a good father. He was in his own world most of the time, thinking up plots, looking at his typewriter, thinking of the Hardy Boys maybe, or a mystery adventure story, or gold mining in Northern Ontario, an article for a magazine. And he just let the kids grow up. And occasionally, if we went to him for advice or help, which we seldom did, he would give it generously. But he never took me aside. Anything of a sexual nature, for example, he never did what a lot of fathers did. When it's the right time, they take the son aside and explain the facts of life. I think I was about 17 or 18 before he got around to that, and it was a little too late.
Oh my!
I'm afraid to have much impact on me, because I was playing hockey with a bunch of other guys, and
I hear you.
we learned among ourselves.
I hear you. Yeah. So, well, then, where do you think that came from? Because it is extensive. I mean, I have read many books in my life, thousands, and I have rarely encountered that type of interaction. I know that your father had, several brothers, and he had a father who was well respected in the community. Do you think
Yes.
it was? And so I'll tell you one thing. It just hit me recently that how come that like the Hardy Boys can be so rich in their actions and their activities outside is because your father and his brothers did that.
No,
No?
I think that's wishful thinking.
No, they weren't
I
out
think
there
it was-
in the tundra, the Canadian wilderness.
Oh, I think his brothers were little hellions, really. My dad would be the
The
good
bookworm.
little boy in the family, let's say. I would
Okay.
think. Now, I mean,
Uh-huh.
there wasn't a strong bond, and never anything about writing. If he talked to me about writing, it would be tell me how good my sister was at
Oh
writing.
my,
So-
oh my. Speaking about your sister, Nora McFarlane Perez, you and her both have written a book about your dad.
Yes.
Yours is unpublished yet, and hers is titled When the Bow Breaks.
She is a good writer, and she did a nice portrayal of family life, our family life, for a certain period of time. I went sort of more the other way about a history of juvenile fiction in which my dad was heavily involved for a lot of his life. And I mentioned other authors, Horatio Alger and others that were
Yes.
popular. And this book of mine will never be published, I'm sure. It's kind of a history of juvenile fiction involving Leslie McFarlane. I don't think publishers are going to knock on my door looking for a book like that. So it'll be in the family archives, and maybe it'll resurface someday.
So yeah, your recent book. You mentioned your recent book. So in
Yes.
terms of timeliness, let's just take a minute to talk about that. Where is it available? What is the title of the book? And why did you decide to write that book now at this time?
Now, are we talking A Hell of a Life in Hockey, or one that I've
Yes.
gone on from there? I have another book called The Maple Leaf Forever coming out next year. But A Hell of a Life in Hockey, A Hell of a Life in Hockey is my own life story, and the problems I had as a broadcaster, health problems, where I was so depressed one time, I said, I have to get out of broadcasting. I can't possibly face another camera without wilting in front of the camera or going to pieces and being terribly embarrassed that I fell over the microphone or something. But I did go through a really tough time getting reestablished in broadcasting. I'd taken a job as a sports director in Montreal, and the job was kind of beyond me. It was a one-person sports department. I had to do all the sports casts. I had to plan sports programming and that sort of thing. And they didn't take that too seriously. I wasn't making much money. I took the job for, let's say, $15,000 a year. And when I got off the plane to start work, they said, we've made an error. We can't pay you as much as the guy that runs the tube department at our major corporation, Marconi. So we're going to drop $2,000 from your salary. And I said, wait a minute, I haven't even started work yet. And you're
Wow.
breaking a promise to me. And that
Wow.
was a bad start. and it got worse. And then
Right.
my nerves began to get frayed, and I was very apprehensive about going on camera. And I was angry and frustrated, and I just quit one day. I was able to hire an assistant finally, Dick Irvin, who went on to a Hall of Fame career, by the way. I gave him his
Yeah.
first. They paid him $75 a week, and I wouldn't hire him at that because he was more valuable than that. So they hired him, not me. But anyway, I'm getting up into an era that I'd rather forget than talk about, because
I hear
I
you.
had to walk. I walked the beach outside our house for a long time and tried to figure out what next I could do. So I got back to Toronto, and I fell apart on camera the very first time I was on. And I had to cover up with using photographs and films. And then I didn't have to face my audience. I could get by a sportscast. And finally, I got a lucky break and wound up with Hockey Night in Canada. I wound up with CBS Sports, the first Canadian to do hockey on national TV in the US.
Wonderful.
On skates. That's why they hired me. I could skate better than any of the other candidates. And I ended up with wonderful years with NBC. They were the best people in the world to work for. And my bosses back at home said, I hear you've been saying nice things about NBC when you're working there, because I was working both places. I said, oh yeah, they're terrific. And he said, we're nice too. I said, oh, okay, yes, of course.
Well, we're Canadian. We have to be nice.
Yeah, that's true.
Wow. Well, I was going to ask, about the Hell of a Life in Hockey, which is available now online, right? Amazon or whatever, what have you.
Oh, I guess so. I did an audio book for it. I've never done an audible book, but right in the middle of the pandemic, when I was coughing a lot, I had to record 12 hours of that book, and it was stop and start. And my voice is better today than it was 3 years ago when I recorded that. It's out there, and it's doing well. I'm proud of that book.
Excellent. Well, I wanted to ask you this, because A Hell of a Life has so many straight up engaging hockey stories, but it also has so many stories that people can use to try to understand this whole concept of being mistreated in the workplace. And you just highlighted that as well. Were you aware that that was going to happen? Did that happen by design, or that's just how it came out?
Well, I didn't expect to have so many problems in broadcasting, but the first game I worked at Maple Leaf Gardens, my boss came up to the broadcast booth and said, Brian, you should speak 3 times a period. That'll be a nice balance with the play-by-play guy. I said, Ted, what if 6 goals are scored? He said, speak about 3 of them. I said, this guy's an idiot. This is NHL hockey we're talking here, and he's got a restriction on my comments 3 times a period. A fight breaks out. Oh, don't talk about the fights. Well, something else. Oh, don't get the owner mad. Don't talk about anything. Be positive about his team. Don't be anything negative. And it didn't work out very well, because soon he was mad at me. The owner was mad at me. And when I defended one of his players who didn't show up for a game because he was having a mental breakdown, I got fired.
Unbelievable.
Taking his side. So I ran into a lot of people who I thought were ignoramuses, really, at times, and it got me into difficulty. So I survived somehow. I lost that job, but I went out to Winnipeg and did their games. And I did Montreal Canadiens games when they were at the height of their power. That was almost a blessing. But that meant a lot more travel. And I was sort of the outlier in the group of broadcasters that I worked with, as the one who was always chipping in with some comment they didn't like.
I picked that up in your book over and over. How did that you're going to have some ignoramuses that you have to deal with?
Occasionally, you have to stand up for yourself, despite the odds against you ever working again for the same people.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Wow. Well, let me tell you this. I've been experiencing a variety, I've told you this, of Hardy Boy incarnations.
Yes.
I've been watching the Disney Hardy Boys, you know? Did you ever see those, the Disney
No,
ones?
I'm not interested.
Okay. Well, it was in the 50s. It was a long time ago.
You described the plot line at one time, and
Yeah.
I don't even care about them, and I'm sure my dad would just shrug and say, "Let them do what they want." That's how that life is behind me. I'm not even concerned.
Well, because the what I was going to say is that having listened, you know, having watched the different Hardy Boys television series, there's been 3 of them, to read the other books, to read the changes. And I know your father, one thing that he did, you know, in his last book, he ended the book with a strong comments about how could they change this book, despite the fact, you know, that your father felt like this was hack writing. It was good writing, and they certainly messed it up in the 50s when
Yes, they did.
they
did.
gutted the books. They took all the
I won't.
heart out of them.
I collect them for my great grandkids now, and I will not touch one of them that was rewritten in the 50s. I always go back to the originals if I can find them, but they're getting pretty expensive. And I have a pretty extensive collection now.
Look what I have. I just bought them.
Oh, those are the good ones. Yeah, the brown covers and the red covers. Yeah.
I opened
Yeah.
that book and it said copyright 1927. I was like, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. So, but what I wanted to ask you is, you did have a series yourself, you know, of boys books, hockey books, the Mitchell boys, right? Do you think that your father's work, well, let me just ask you this. What inspired you to write the Mitchell Boys series?
You know, it's going back quite a few years now. I don't really, I think a publisher probably approached me and asked me about doing something with juvenile writing, and I guess we conspired and decided to do the Mitchell brothers books. And I regretted that title later because I didn't realize at the time there were 2 Mitchell brothers in California who were up on porn charges.
Oh my
And
gosh.
somebody said that to me. I said, "Oh my God, I can't change the titles now. The books are being printed."
Oh my.
Or I could, and I picked the Mitchell brothers because my next door neighbor was named Mitchell and he had a couple of boys. I can't define why I picked the 30s. I think it was because I remembered the 30s as being a real good time for kids. And you
Okay.
played hockey and you played football, and it was a simpler life. And I wanted to get them, if I wanted to have girls play on a football team, I could do that in the 30s in a small town, and who would care? Now you wouldn't find a girl, I don't think, on any of the posh high school teams they have.
Yeah,
But you might.
only as a kicker. They can be a
Yeah,
kicker
the kicker, yeah.
in football.
Well, I have her as a linesman.
Yeah. Well, here we're coming to the end of the interview, and I really appreciate your time. Let me tell you this. Let me just ask you straight out. What does it take to be a writer who sells more than 1 million books?
Would you repeat that, Steve? What?
So what
What?
does it take to
Oh.
be a writer who sells more than 1 million books as you have?
I guess a long life, because I've been writing now for 50, 60 years, I guess. And you've got to be prolific. You can't waste a lot of time. You settle down to write a book, and you better damn well write it. But
Wow.
I wrote because I enjoyed writing it and getting these kids in and out of problems and getting a happy ending and seeing the book in print and making a few bucks. You don't get wealthy, I found out, being prolific or having 100 books.
I hear you. And you know what? Before I ask you the very last question, I do want to say this, is that all through the years, there have been, you know, a number of people who have written about your father and the deal with Stratemeyer, and over, you know, it says, even your sister said it in her book, you know, my dad understood and my dad used the money, he needed the money. But quite honestly, Brian, in your book, you take a different turn. You do say, hey, my father understood the $100, but darn it, you basically said that was not right.
No, it wasn't right. And it was the situation in that era. This Stratmeyer guy, my dad never thought he was a bad person. He said he was a bright guy. He never met him, but he said he colored the whole juvenile fiction market, and exploited it. And he had writers here, there, and everywhere, and he became a millionaire. I'm sure he died at 60, so he didn't have much chance to spend his money. And his daughters took over the company, and they changed it all around, and they rewrote the books and everything. And I just think if my dad had had a penny a book for the Hardy Boys, and they sold upwards of 100 million copies over the century, he would have done pretty well. We wouldn't have had to struggle as badly as we did. But then the struggle is always what builds character, I think. If we'd had a very rich father, who knows how his 3 kids would have ended up. I don't think I'd have been better for it if he'd been able to afford me to send me to a private school and have my own car at 16 and get drinking beer at 17, and all of your life changes might be dependent on how much income you have in the family. I have no regrets either, but I do feel it was unfair. Yes.
I hear you. Okay. Well, let me tell you, I think that my last question, you had already answered it, because I was going to ask you about advice you have for young writers. But I think when you said, if you sit down to write a book, you better damn well finish it.
Well, that's good advice, isn't it?
Right?
Yeah. I wish my family member would take that advice. You're right. And I'm also fear that at 91, any day now, I might lose everything up here. So I've put books that I wrote 10 years ago in my computer, and I gradually reach out to publishers. And one day I'll be pleasantly surprised when somebody says, that hockey book you wrote back in 20 years ago, it's good. Let's publish it. Now, my family, my heirs will say, sure, let's do it in memory of Granddad.
Exactly. Well, I'm happy to hear that you have a bunch of things in your computer. That means that, for the next 10, 20 years, we may have trickle out books here and there by Brian McFarlane. So I hope that your children are ready for that.
And if they're smart, they'll say, but you got to buy a painting to go along with it, because right in this area next to me, I have 100 paintings that I'm very proud of.
Is there any way we could see any of them? I'm so excited to maybe show the audience a painting or two.
Oh, that's the sort of thing I do.
Oh my gosh, that looks like a scene out of the Mitchell Brothers.
Yeah, there's pond hockey scenes. I could do I'm thinking of doing a pond hockey book with my own illustrations.
That's beautiful.
And I'm getting better, Steve. I just started about 10 years ago in Florida, and I'm keep trying to paint better skies, and I'm not very good with the figures, but I'm working on it. Okay.
Well, that's incredible. And that's an inspiration, because 91 or 81, and you said, let me start this new endeavor.
Yeah.
Painting.
Well, my wife and I keep busy. She was teaching fitness classes at age 81 at Burning Man out in Nevada, 60,000 people in the desert. Burning
Unbelievable.
Man?
Joan, we're going to have to interview you next.
Okay.
You are also a wave maker. This is actually season 2 of my podcast. I don't know if you got to hear any of season 1, but it's called Wavemakers. And this is going to be called Wavemakers, the book series, because it's about people who have made a difference, made an impact with books. And you have certainly done that.
I'm honored to be part of it. And I knew from the first time I talked to you on the phone, there was something special about this guy. I'm not sure what it is, but now I know what it is.
Well, you know what? One thing I have to ask you this, because of the hockey thing. How were you able to have so many hockey goals in a sport that is not a high-scoring sport? And how do you feel that the record still stands from St. Lawrence?
Well, I can't explain that, Steve. I was a pretty good junior player, but I was never thinking of, well, I did think about professionalism, but I wasn't a natural athlete. I just loved hockey and I loved to skate, and I could skate faster than I could walk, and I wasn't a good runner. So my skating was good, and I learned to stick handle and score the odd goal. And I got to be pretty good, but I was a realist. I said, there are 800 guys in Canada better than I am. So I'm going to go to a US college because they're looking for hockey players, starting programs at St. Lawrence. That was the second year they had hockey. They had a new arena, and I went down there, and suddenly I'd set records, but I didn't know they were records because there was nothing to compare them with.
Right.
I know today, after all these years of graduation, and they've had a dozen or so guys make the NHL from St. Lawrence, and somehow I outscored them, and I can't believe it, because they were obviously better players than I was. But the
What did
goals went
Joan
in,
just
and
say? What did Joan just said something?
Sorry? Oh, yeah, we played half the games they did, they do today, but
Oh my gosh, half the games and you still, oh my goch, that's incredible. Well, let's put it this way. You were playing against Americans and you're a Canadian. That's the answer.
oh, there were a lot of Canadians playing down there, but
Oh,
the
okay.
Americans were very good. But the NHL didn't think they were any good, so they didn't scout them. Billy Cleary from Harvard was one of the best players I ever played against, and Montreal grudgingly drafted him, I think 20 down the road somewhere. But
Wow.
when you have a Harvard education and some pro team wants you to play for them for $5,000 a year, you're going to think twice about being the fourth line center on the Montreal Canadiens if you can go to Wall Street and make $100,000 a year.
There you go. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you one thing. It has been, like I said earlier, it's been a joy to meet you, to know you. And I thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. People are going to be very grateful to you for doing this interview, as I am.
You can edit it well, and I can say too, it's been very grand to meet you. And Joan agrees with me too. So she gets a vote in your favor too. So.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Steve Rios. Welcome to Season 2 of Wavemakers.